On March 23rd, 1775, in one of the most famous, probably most well-known speeches in American history, on the eve of the American Revolution, Patrick Henry stood in front of a group of people and said, "It is in vain, sir, to extenuate the matter. Gentlemen may cry peace, peace, but there is no peace. The war has actually begun." You may have heard that before. Those were not new words to him. In fact, you can go to Jeremiah chapter 6, read, "Because from the least of them, even to the greatest of them, everyone is given to covetousness. And from the prophet even to the priest, everyone deals falsely. They have also healed the hurt of my people slightly, saying, peace, peace, when there is no peace." All of us, in some form or fashion, long for peace, right? In our jobs, where we live, you'll hear people pray for peace, but there's also a necessity of peace within the church. We've talked in each month, we've had one lesson that dealt with the local church. And this morning, we're going to talk about peace in the local church. And I know what may be thought to you right now is, well, this seems like a really peaceful group of people. I agree with that. So I might be preaching something that's not necessarily relevant to all of us. But how many of you have ever had an agreement with another person? We can all relate to this, right? How many of you, maybe don't call it as a disagreement, but how many of you maybe see things different than another person sees them? Well, sometimes those are the tiny little seeds that can germinate into a lack of peace. Because for the most part, I sort of putting things aside and say, we're going to work for a common cause. But I think the word there is important, work toward a common cause. Because maintaining the peace, keeping the peace, is a requirement of work. There is a necessity for work in that. So if you think this morning, well, there's peace in the local church, that's not really a problem, that's fine, but it's because work has been done to make sure that it's not a problem. And it will only not be a problem going forward if work like that continues. So we're going to discuss that with the local church, this idea of peace. What Jameson read there just a moment ago, Ephesians chapter 4, the last sentence, I think it says, unity of spirit and the bond of peace. And we must endeavor to keep it, is the word that was used there by Paul to the Ephesians. I believe the word endeavor was the title of a series of spaceships that were used, the spaceship Endeavor, I think it was. And I think that's a fitting thing for space discovery and space exploration, is that you had to go out and try and find things. Well, there are things that are a long way away. There are things in space that you say it was light years away and millions of years. And these things that they just said, well, it's an endeavor. But they had to work toward that. It was a constant striving. It's not like walking from here to that seat. It's a little bit farther. But for some of us, it's an endeavor to go from one point to another. Well, if we think about peace in the church, we have to endeavor, Paul says, to do the same thing. In Proverbs chapter 20 and verse 3, this is the New King James. It says, "It's honorable for a man to stop striving, since any fool can start a quarrel." But I actually like a version of the Bible here, the Good News Bible translation. I want you to think about this term here for just a second. Any fool can start arguments. The honorable thing is to stay out of them. That's what the Good News Bible, I don't know how that translates, but I think that works for us, right? How many of you know people that like to argue? You might be that person who likes to argue, but it's to jump into an argument, right? It's kind of hard to stay back. How many of you have ever heard somebody say something that's like, that is just completely wrong? It was like, I would sure like to. But sometimes it's better to stay out of it. The other day, I was in line at the store, and the person in front of me was saying something, and the person that was waiting on them was saying something back, and it had to do with the school. It had to do with the Gary County school. And every single thing that they said was completely wrong. And I just wanted to say, I was just want to say, I go every day. You can come with, and I will promise you it's not the most perfect place in the world. But I can also promise you that a lot of stuff that people talk about is not happening at the school. But I also thought if I say this, then they're going to come back and they're going to say, well, I heard this, and then I heard it, and then there's 8 people in line. All I want to do is get a gallon of gas. I don't need y'all up here arguing. And then what have I gained from that? I sort of bit my tongue, bit my hand, bit all the parts of me there just to make sure I wasn't saying something back. But we could easily fall into that sort of argument pretty quick, right? We can find those at any time during the day to be able to jump in. But the honorable thing there we read is to stay out of it. So I want to think about this for a second. We can have peace without unity. In Romans chapter 12 and verse 18, we read, if it is possible, as much as depends on you, live peaceably with all men. And so if we're talking about people within the church, and that's really our focus here today is within the church, is that we need to be peaceably living with all of people. Now, that does not necessarily mean it'll be easy. There may be times when we disagree. But like I said here, we can have peace without unity. You can always have peace. But the flip side here, you cannot have unity without peace. That's impossible. The bond mentioned by Paul in the scripture reading is that which binds us together. If unity binds us together, we got to have some sort of an agreement here to be able to work together. Think about 2 horses that are pulling a plow or pulling a wagon or something like that. If you got 2 of them or 2 oxen or whatever, if they're yoked together, they may not like each other, but they got to come to some sort of agreement that we're both going to walk in this same direction. Well, in the church, we're yoked together here, right? We're yoked together with Jesus. We have to work to strive to go forward together. Now, does that mean that it's always going to be perfect? Absolutely not. Does that mean that we might kick a little bit? I'm sure horses and cattle kick a little bit when they're bound together as well. But we have to work together toward this unity because you cannot have unity without peace. When a congregation is divided for any reason, that puts everybody in an awkward position. Most of you are familiar with Jack Hall. Jack Hall spent 2 years, I think, several years back, working with the congregation that had effectively just split right down the middle. The best way to describe it is these people here went one way and these people went the other way, and they didn't like each other for whatever reason. And they called Jack in, and Jack worked with those people more. But how awkward do you think going to church would be on a Sunday morning if you knew that everybody on the other side didn't like you? And maybe on the flip side, you didn't like them either. That'd be terrible, right? That would be awful. But we have to strive to avoid that. That puts you into this awkward position. And so no matter what the issue, we have to find our way to sort of work through this. We have to find peace with. So we're going to look at 3 things today, 3 concerns regarding peace in the church and how are we handling. Well, number 1, let's start with the first thing. Let's start with number 1, which is going to say, let's keep Christ front and center. Okay, we'll put that here to start with. I want you to think about organizations that you might be familiar of, that you might be part of. The common thread in these organizations is some kind of like-mindedness. Perhaps you've got the same hobby. For a while, I was in the Historical Society at Garrett County. I was the youngest person by about 75 years, I think. But I had a like-minded view with those people. Everybody that was there is, if you want to talk about something historical, they were ready to jump in. If you were not interested in history, it would have been the worst group of people that you ever would have wanted to hang out with because they didn't have anything. They didn't want to talk to you. You wouldn't have wanted to talk to them. But you might have something like that, a similar hobby. You might like the same sports team. How many of us can talk about Kentucky for a good bit of time? Did you notice Alan the other night, he mentioned Alabama, and there was, everybody kind of did that. Nobody want to hear that right there. We can talk about Kentucky of like-minded. If you walk in here, I have a student that he has an orange sweatshirt. It's not a Tennessee sweatshirt, but he'll wear this sweatshirt from time to time. And he'll walk in, and I was like, I can't even talk to you today. I'm not even going to talk to somebody wearing orange. It's easy for us to find like-mindedness with people that we have commonalities with. They might be in political beliefs, and sometimes that is a divide as well. But those people are easy to get along with, the people that you have all beliefs the same way. You're not going to go to the Historical Society meeting if you're not interested in learning about history. Well, you're not going to go to the UK game and wear a Louisville shirt, right? Or a Tennessee shirt. You're going to be with people that are like-minded. But when we think about it, we're in a club we're in a group of like-minded people, at least theoretically, with fellow Christians. But however, we sometimes lack peace with those very people that we claim to be like-minded with, that we claim to have similarities to. We sometimes lack peace with those people. And so what happens if that's the case? How should we then resolve the problem? Well, the reality is that when peace and disunity emerge within the church, what's going to happen? Well, we look to the Bible to find our answers. That's good, right? I'm going to look to the Bible to find my answer. I think that's absolutely what we should do. But sometimes, just like we do with our hobbies, just like we do with our sports team, just like we do with our politicians, we look to the Bible to find the answer that proves I'm right, not the answer that says what God said. Because if I want to talk about UK and I want to find a way to prove that this guy shouldn't be playing on the team, I'm going to give you all the stats that show the bad about him. And if you say, here's some good, I don't want to talk about that, I want to talk about the bad. Well, sometimes we do that in the church. We look for the Bible, we say, well, where's a good verse that I can look at that'll prove Ben wrong and prove me right. Not, well, let's figure out what Jesus said about this, but rather we look instead to support our own. That does that, I feel. Just because somebody refers to the Bible doesn't necessarily mean that Christ is at the center of their understanding, center of their thinking. If your starting point for understanding Christ in the Bible is simply to prove somebody else wrong, you're going about it all wrong yourself. That can't be our starting point. Jesus has to be at the center of it, not me or you. We read in Philippians chapter 2 and verse 8 that Jesus, being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death, even the death of the cross. Jesus had conflicts with people while he was here on the earth. There was all sorts of times. We've talked a little bit about this on Wednesday night with our miracle conversations, but there were people sort of coming to him with issues, complaints, fussing, trying to prove him wrong, trying to say negative things about him, whatever you might want to think. But not everybody approached with good intentions. But we see quite often that Jesus very rarely does he get angry. Very rarely is this effort to sort of one up. We've never seen whenever Jesus performs a miracle that he turns around and sort of taunts the crowd after the fact. Every time something like that happens, what does Jesus usually do? It's like, don't go tell anybody about this. It's almost like I need to get focused more on the teaching that we see right here. Jesus used that approach. We read that Paul advocated in Colossians chapter 4 and verse 6. Colossians 4 and 6, speech always be with grace, seasoned with salt, that you may know how you ought to answer each one. Well, see, the problem when we think about peace in the church is sometimes we don't use our speech in that same way. That grace seasoned with salt, it's almost like instead, if I disagree with you or if you disagree with me, it's like I'm going to start yelling at you and fussing at you, right? What if we're doing that to fellow Christians? Well, Jesus said not to do it, but I'm going to do it anyway, and I'm going to do it to you because you disagree with what I think. Well, we've made it back about us again, right? Say it's right here at the top. Keep Christ front and center. Instead of making it about me, let's make it then about Jesus. Second one, we need to be a good representative of both Christ and the church. Question. You ever heard somebody call a Christian a hypocrite? You don't have to go far to hear. You don't have to talk to many people to hear that heard. Too often we fail the eye test of those that are outside of Christ, right? They look at us and they say, that's not really something that I think I want to be part of. Well, why would they think that? Well, we espouse doing good. We claim we're going to do this or that. But instead, we come across as self-centered. It's all about me. Well, we just talked about that, right? Let me prove you wrong. Sometimes come across as self-centered. Sometimes we come across as argumentative. I would like to talk with that person about the Bible, but all they want to do is argue. If I say something that maybe sounds a little bit different, that person that claims to be a Christian just immediately jumps on me. Wrong, 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 wrong. We can all fall into that trap pretty easily, right? We become hypercritical of the things that we don't like. I sometimes struggle with that. That everything would be better if it was done the way that I think it should be done, right? How many of you agree with that? No, you're not talking about me. You're talking about yourself. I'm sorry. I've poorly asked question. But if we all had it the exact way that we want it, is that possible? No, because we all want it a different way. But sometimes when we as Christians come across other people, it's like, this is how I want it to be. This is how it should be. And anything that well, let's think about that for just a second. Is that being a good representative of Christ? Well, Ben often says that Christians, often describes Christians God's hands and feet on earth. You ever heard Ben say that before? Well, think about what your hands and feet are there for. God sent Jesus to do what? He sent him to live, to serve, to die, to be resurrected. But one of the best qualities that I saw of Jesus when we read through the Bible is Jesus's empathy. You know what empathy is? I hope you do, because I don't feel like there's a whole lot of empathy around the world, maybe as there should be. If you think about what empathy is, I'll give you the by the book definition. It's the ability to feel in tune with appropriate compassion. See, in order to be empathetic towards someone, you got to be able to put yourselves in their shoes right there. Well, if I can't put myself in your shoes, if I can't see what you're experiencing, I'm not going to have any empathy towards you. But see, sometimes we don't want to see what other people are experiencing. We want it to be, what was that we talked about a minute ago? About me, right? Why can't you see it my way? Well, that's not what we're looking for right here. Jesus showed empathy throughout. This empathy has to be felt for people out of it. It's also going to be felt for people on the inside of the congregation as well. It's easy to feel empathy for people that have similar thoughts as you. I can be real empathetic with you, things the exact same way as I do. But there's 40 people in this room. I'd say there's at least 25 or 30 different views on any topic that might come up. How can I feel empathy toward you if only mine is right? How can I see things from your side? And here's the thing. If only I'm right, and if only it's always got to be about me, I'm going to drive a wedge between myself and those that are out here. And that peace that we've endeavored to keep isn't going to be there because you're wrong and I'm right, and we can't bridge that gap. That's not being a good representative of Christ in the church. But this requires work, right? What I'm saying here requires a little bit of work because we can look around to people that we come in contact with and we can say, I just don't agree with this person. Well, it takes a little bit of work to be able to do this. Turn to 1 Peter chapter 2 if you've got your Bible handy. It's just 3 verses. But 1 Peter chapter 2, starting with verse 21. I don't think this is new. In fact, I think most of you will be familiar with these verses. But we read here in 1 Peter chapter 2, starting in verse 21, for to this you were called, because Christ also suffered for us, leaving us an example that you should follow his steps. See, Jesus was an empathetic figure. He showed empathy toward people that he came in contact with. I want to think about. Remember what Jesus, he went, first of all, he was talking to her, had her draw him a drink of water, right? And she'd been married all these different times or whatever. Well, what would we have thought about that woman the first time we saw her? You can run through every word you could probably come up with. Most of them you wouldn't say right here in front of this congregation. All the negative things that you might have thought about that person. What did Jesus do for her? He told her to go and sin no more, right? Time and place for a lecture on all the things that she did wrong. Could Jesus have pulled out the scrapbook and said, wrong, wrong, wrong? And she would have just gotten fuming right there. Just, that. He told her, go and sin no more. Think about that for a second. Jesus was showing empathy toward her situation. I don't know what she had been through. I'd say there was some bad choices made on her part and some bad choices made by some other people as well. But what Jesus did is introduced himself to her. And he said, in the past, you might have done some things that were wrong, but let's focus on what's going forward. See, what happens is when we think about peace in the church, that wedge, that divide is always something that happened in the past. And now we're sitting here mad and fussing about something that happened in the past instead of saying, let's move forward and see what we can do. But we got to have that empathy toward other people to recognize what happened. Keep going in 1 Peter 2. For who committed no sin, nor was deceit found in his mouth, who, when he was reviled, did not revile in return, when he suffered, did not threaten, but committed himself to him who judges rightly. See, that's the thing about peace. When we're reviled, we like to revile in return. When we're suffering, we like to threaten in return as well. But that's not what Jesus did. Peter said Jesus committed himself to him who judges rightly. For there to be peace in the church, our behavior has to be caring, focused on others. It has to be peaceful. If we can't treat other people of like faith properly, how are we going to grow? And not only that, what's heaven going to be like if you can't get along with the people that you're going to be in heaven with? You may not be there. Third one, let God handle it. You know, sometimes we see things we don't like or disagreements, and it's just hard for us to solve that problem. But Jesus is head of the church, and the Holy Spirit's been guiding it since its creation. And I don't claim to know everything about the Holy Spirit. In fact, it's one of the more challenging things. I know that the Spirit's role is to help both Christians and help the church as well. And so quite often, though, we don't give a whole lot of space. We don't give a lot of room. We don't give a lot of extra air for things to materialize, for things to develop, for things to resolve. We like to be the one in charge, right? You know anybody that likes to be the one in charge? I think it's written on my birth certificate sometimes that, yeah, I want to be in charge of this. Sometimes we don't want to be the one in charge, but sometimes we want to be the one that's in charge. We'd rather be the leader instead of the follower, right? What Paul write near the end of Ephesians, chapter 6, verses 18 through 20. It said, praying always with prayer and supplication in the Spirit, being watchful to this end with all perseverance and supplication for all the saints, and for me, that utterance may be given to me, that I may open my mouth boldly and make known the mystery of the gospel, for which I am an ambassador in chains, that I may speak boldly as I ought to speak. See, what Paul is saying here is that he imprisoned or whatever would be. He says he's praying for the Spirit to sort of do the work. He's laying it, he's telling it, but they may not listen to him. The Spirit's going to have to work within these folks that he's talking to. When we allow the Spirit to do the work, we sort of become that humble follower. We can't be certain that it's our personal preferences that are being done. Because if we're not careful, when we're talking about people, we're talking about the church, when we're talking about people that we're working with, it becomes, you need to do this, and you need to do this, and you need to do this. Well, are those things from the Bible, or those things I think you need to do? Because if I'm not careful, the things that I think you need to do start to lean a little toward tradition, start to lean a little bit toward my way, and you're not really being a follower of God, you're being a follower of me, and I'm telling you what you need to do. That's not the way it works. We need to let God handle that. The Spirit can lead, the Spirit can settle any kind of matter that comes up. We selfishly fight against it. So I want to take a couple questions home with us. When it comes to peace in the church, let's look at these. And I don't know if you can see these very good or not. When I made them, they look pretty good. They may be a little small. But the first question, what's the root cause of the division? Is it religious or is it personal? If there's a lack of peace within the church, if there's a division in some form or fashion, what's the root cause of it? Is it religious or is it personal? I dare say that the answer to that is probably more personal than it is religion when there's division within the church. Because usually when there's division in anything, it's probably going to be personal. But that's our first question. Question 2. Do we have any blind assumptions on the issue? Do we assume that everyone feels about the exact same way that we do? You know, one of the things that's always striking to me is when I'm teaching class at school and the kid's like, yeah, I agree, we're writing an answer. And then sometimes the kid will raise their hand and they'll say something that is completely different from what I've been talking about. And I don't mean off the wall, like, they're talking, we're talking about social studies, they're talking about science. I don't mean that, but they just say something. There are so many things that I do when I teach that come from kids that have said things in the past because I had never thought about it that way. You know, sometimes within the church, we have these blind assumptions. We have this thought, well, she believes that way, and he believes that way, and she believes that way. But then when they say something, it's a totally different view from what we have. See, if we're not careful, we sort of become myopic. We sort of focus in squarely in on this one thing, and we don't think that other people come from a completely different world. People come from a completely different background. People have completely different experiences. Jesus didn't talk to the people. You know, we talked about when Jesus did miracles, we've done like 6 of them on Wednesday night, and they've all been something different. You know why they were something different? Those people were all different. Those people all needed something different at a different time. The church can't become so solely focused that we can't be willing to hear something from somebody on the other side, from somebody in the pew next to you who might have been thinking this for 20 years and never said it because, like, well, everybody should think this. No, those kinds of things cause division. Number 3, have we spent time together studying the Bible for an answer that causes that lack of peace? Not finding the verse in the Bible that makes me right and you wrong, but studying the Bible to find an answer to that solution, or to a solution to that question. That's what our task should be. That's what we should do when we come together each time. That's what Sunday morning and Wednesday night should be about. Those are times for us to come together to study things, to hear things presented, to read things, but also to hear what other people think about this. Where do we come from? And let's work together, because there's not going to be peace if I stand here and talk for an hour and nobody says anything ever, and then you just go home and you got to be thinking the way. That's not the way it works, because when you find it's something that you disagree with, if I don't let you say that back to me, then that's where the wedge comes in. Number 4, are we making every effort to do what leads to peace and mutual edification? Romans chapter 14, verse 19, we read, therefore, let us pursue the things which make for peace and the things by which one may edify another. Do you know what it means to pursue? Sometimes you'll hear police officers, they'll say they're in pursuit of something. That may be a word. They're going after something right there. Hunters would be in pursuit of prey, whatever it would be. Well, in Romans 14, verse 19, we need to pursue the things which make for peace, the things that build up each other. Sometimes people pursue things that prohibit peace from happening. Sometimes people seek things out that will drive a wedge within it. Do we do that? Do you do that? Do we think, is this a positive pursuit? There's a sign that hangs right outside the gym in our high school, and it talks about social media, and it says to think before you do something. And they all stand, the letters all stand for something. I can't remember exactly what it was, but is this thoughtful? Is it helpful? Is it inspiring? Is it not negative or something like that? Is it kind? You know, sometimes we pursue the completely wrong things, and we sometimes pursue that within church, and that's where that divide comes in. Paul told the Ephesians that the unity of spirit and the bond of peace were necessary. And so our last question, number 5 up there, are you doing your part to maintain the peace among the brethren? I don't think there's a divide in this building. I didn't preach this sermon to advocate for there being a divide or to try and pull something out that's not there. But it's took a lot of work to get to this point, and it'll take a whole lot of work to make sure that that peace remains, because that's an absolute necessity for the church. If there's anything that we can do for you this morning, any way that we can help you, we've presented this, we've talked about this. I hope that it's something that you can take with you and apply to your life as you go forward. But if there's any way we can help you, anything we can do, we invite you to come while we stand and sing.
Jesus for the cleansing power. Are you washed in the blood of the Lamb? Are you fully trusting in His grace this hour? Are you